Mr. Mike. I'll let you introduce yourself, mate. You've got a rather a reputation of being a bad motherfucker.
I guess maybe just a training nerd. I'm Mike Tuchscherer. I've been powerlifting since 2003, like official competitions, and I've been coaching since not long after that. It's kind of a long story, but I ended up kind of a de facto coach of my university club team, and I've been coaching ever since. And so these days, that's primarily what I do. I've started coaching almost entirely online, probably around the 2008 timeframe, which is when we started reactive training systems. So these days, we're primarily a coaching company, but we also do a lot of coaching education. So teaching concepts to other coaches, um, and we're kind of doing more in like training theory spaces as well. Like I'm a huge training nerd, so I like to think about all this stuff. So which I'm sure we'll get into today, and trying to think about more ways to make some of the headier concepts accessible to people.
Hmm. What would you think is the biggest barrier then?
For that type of thing,
Yeah.
that I guess just that there's so many nested concepts, right?
Hmm.
So I would love to talk about, like, I'm the, the coaching staff at RTS would tell you that I kind of lost my mind around things related to fatigue from like 2018 to 2019. Like we have we use Slack for our internal communications, and like I would post these long, just rambling thoughts that I was having around this or that or the other thing. And but it's all these nested concepts. Like none of that would make sense if you didn't also understand stress index, and if you didn't understand like why that was the way it was, or some of the other things that we think and believe around training. Um, but like once you get there, then I think some of that stuff gets more interesting. But then ultimately, what do you do about it? Well, I mean, if you're also a training nerd and you like to learn about this stuff, then then learn all of it. But if you're not, it can still make a positive impact to training. So it's okay. How do we digest this and boil it down to, okay, what do I do today? What decisions should I make? Because that's ultimately what it's going to come down to. Um, so yeah, trying to get there.
So if you like wind the tape back, what started the training nerd in you that was like got lit up and was like, I need to learn everything I need to know about this thing?
I don't know, really. I mean, I've just always been interested in it, like from the very beginning. So I started lifting weights in 97. I was 12, and there was a club team at my school. It wasn't even competitive. It was just like, hey, let's go lift weights, and the teacher would show you different exercises and stuff like that. And I found out that I was pretty good at it, nothing ridiculous. I've heard plenty of ridiculous stories. Mine wasn't that outlandish, but better than my peers. Um, so I got interested in lifting, and so did kind of whatever. I mean, you're freaking 12, so who cares? Um, but then I remember when I got into high school, I was a freshman in high school, and I was a football player as well. And I showed up to the weight room uh, for the first day of like football weight training. And I handed the coach my program. I was like, here, this is the program that I want to do. And it was just a program that I wrote, pieced together from, shit that I read, mostly magazines even, because this would have been 99, not a whole lot of internet fitness going on. And what was out there wasn't that great.
Hmm.
So I wrote a program and said, here, this is what I want to do. And I'm grateful that he was just like, yeah, okay, go for it. you know because like I was clearly switched on. I was excited about weight training, excited enough to like try to make my own program. And I mean, in hindsight, I think about it and I think he's probably just trying not to squash my enthusiasm, which was great. It worked, and I was in there, I trained harder, and um, yeah, it was just more excited about it than, any of my peers. And it showed. It went very well. I was the strongest kid in the area and everything like that. So that was all like positive that came from it. And I guess like thinking while I'm talking, that's probably when a big part of what kicked off that training nerdism, you know?
Mm. Yeah, especially when you start getting those newbie gains, right? You're like, oh, something's kind of working, but it's working a lot. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, let's learn as much as we can and start jotting things down. And yeah, back into the magazine days.
Uh-huh.
And
I remember learning that you could do fewer than 5 reps.
oh
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
that,
yeah.
yeah. I remember like figuring that out. And I remember like kind of wrestling with it a little bit too. Like, oh wait, you can do 3 reps. So I, was doing it for a while and was getting really strong, and like kind of being concerned that was like, I don't know, man, I might just never do anything more than 3 reps again because this is working really well.
Yeah, like stuck in the 10 to 12 or the 8 to 12. You're like, ah,
Hmm.
okay, let's do 4 by 8 to 12. And in 3 weeks' time, I'll increase the weight or whatever. But it's like, yeah, you start learning about the threes. You're like, okay, I'm never going to do anything more than 5 again.
Paradigms are a hell of a thing. It's like, I mean, it seems so, it's kind of funny now to think back on it, but like, this idea that you can't, like, oh, wait, it's possible to do fewer than 5 reps. Like, that just blew my mind. Like, well, yeah, you could do 1, 2, 3. You can do any number of reps that you want. you know. Um, but yeah, that would be like a valid training decision. So, and I mean, there have been a few events like that have kind of stood out, like the realization of stuff you didn't previously realize was possible. Some training related, some not, but um, that always kind of sticks with me too. This idea of that there might be something that you haven't even thought of yet that could be important.
Hmm.
It's good motivation to keep turning over rocks.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's like, you come up with a concept and it's like, oh, well, how do I figure out whether this is true or not? Well, I'd probably get in the weight room and go try it. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
And I kind of miss those days. I'll,
yeah.
I'll have it still. You'll create something. You're like, oh, I am pretty sure that's gonna work. Like
Mhm.
95% sure, and you're like, but there's that 5% in the back of my head that's like, Alex, you probably need to think that one over a little bit more. So you're like, cool, I'm
Well,
gonna go in and figure it out.
I think there's a lot to be said for that. That the the coach who is also a practitioner. That, I mean, I've noticed things from that I just wouldn't have otherwise noticed.
Mhm.
That you start to notice like internal, I don't know, things going on internally
Mhm.
while you're trying something new. Here, good example. Recently, I've started employing a bit more metabolic work, in particular. I guess we could hand wring over the exercise science of it, but lots of coaches will call it an oxidative protocol,
Mhm.
where you take a fairly lightweight, like 30% of 1 RM, and you do 40 seconds on, 60 seconds off for 4 rounds. And then you do as many series as you need to do to get, the workload that you want to get. Um, so I got curious about that for the purposes of, developing energy systems and possibly, making things like that. And I thought, this is a thing that I need to do it. I need to do it first. I need to see what's the experience like, because that's a very important thing, especially from an athlete's perspective, where that's primarily your point of contact with training is your experience of the training, so I went and did it, and it was fine, but I did make some realizations, like I would want to limit the number of series to probably one or two our first time out, and I wouldn't have necessarily thought that was important if I hadn't done it first, and I wouldn't. So there's things that you'll think of, having lived through the experience of it, that you may not realize just writing it on paper.
Yeah, you've taken the human side out of it, right? And you're just seeing the numbers, the words on the paper or on the screen, and it's
Right.
I think it is so important to get that feeling, because then you can
Yeah.
also empathize with the athletes too, right? You're like, oh, okay, cool. Like
Right.
I know what you're feeling right now because I've put myself through that ringer too.
Well, like say you're designing a training session, and one thing that comes to mind is when I've designed energy system circuits and things like that before, that I'm always mindful of putting too many things that tax the grip or too many things that tax the lower back in sequence, because once those things go, you're kind of screwed for the rest of the circuit.
Yeah.
It's not the same as getting like a biceps pump or something. It's you're done. And again, like that's not something that I would have thought of until I did it a couple times. It was like, oh wait, this kind of ruins it when I structure it this way. I mean, how many athletes need to have a bad experience before you understand that as a coach? Well, if you try it yourself first, not that many.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree.
Yeah.
How long has reactive been around then?
Since 2008.
Wow.
That's when we officially became a thing.
And then I mean, I can't get over how many. Is it world record holders or is it world athletes?
12 world record holders at the last time I counted.
That's insane.
It is. I'm very proud of that, and I would like to say that was like part of a master plan or something. But I mean, I certainly enjoy working with athletes at that level, but it's a fortunate opportunity that I've been given.
I mean, it's always going to be part planned and part like these athletes are just above and beyond, right? Like you can plan for everything, but as we know, like genetic differences, people come in, you're like, you are literally a freak.
Well, and I've definitely had my share of those, that I've picked up some athletes that were already at that level, and that's a different kind of training experience for sure. It like when I first started working with Dennis Cornelius, I mean, he was already winning IPF Worlds by a lot, and I'd been talking to him for a long time. We talked about training for a long time, and he finally decided that he wanted me to do some coaching for him. And I remember thinking a little bit, like feeling like the dog that caught the car, and I thought there's so many ways for me to do this badly. There's so many ways for this to go wrong. And honestly, I'm not sure that you can't be sure in that moment that there's any ways for it to go right. Like you have an athlete like Dennis Cornelius. What if it's just not possible for him to get better? Well, at the same time, I don't really believe that, so we try it. And fortunately, that's one that worked out. We definitely had some really good training blocks and some good competitions come from that arrangement. So like there's that type of experience, But then there's the other type of experience too, like Liz Craven or Bryce Krawczyk. Um, I started working with them before, like well before they were at that level. And so that's a different kind of thing too, that you just keep doing the best you can and you see where you end up, which is really what you should do anytime. You just, let's make the best training we can. We're going to take things as far as we can go, and we end up where we end up. Hopefully that's something cool. But at a minimum, it will be the best that we can do. And that's worth it by itself.
For sure. What's it like taking on board an athlete who's already at the top of their game? Because like throughout the years, I've coached some pretty good athletes, right? But they've all been kids. The international ones have been like middle teens / late teenagers, right? And they you kind of a mentor in that sense more than okay, this is what you're going to do, a coach. They're still looking up to how am I supposed to live life, and it's kind of just guiding them a little bit more, and they're going to eventually go down the stream that they're going to go down. But taking on an athlete that's already a world champion and already at the top of their game and be like, how am I going to get better? You're like, fuck, you're already blowing
Yeah.
people out the water. How am I supposed to infiltrate that mindset and then improve upon it?
Yeah. I mean, I believe in the process that we use. So that helps tremendously. Dennis is a good example, but we could talk about Brett Gibbs or several others probably. Like when they come in, it's definitely a lot more collaborative than it would be for somebody who's less experienced. And that's not really so much about the level that they're at, but more the experience that they've got. That they've already been doing lots of effective training. So, they wouldn't be coming to me if they didn't think I had something to contribute.
For sure.
But at the same time, they have something to contribute too, and that has to be respected. So I would say anybody that has that kind of training experience should be dealt with similarly. Now, if you're talking about someone who's, maybe more novice, maybe a little bit more toward the beginner stages, which in powerlifting, we rate the beginner stage pretty broadly, I think. Like you'll hear somebody say less than 4 years of training, you're still a beginner. That's a pretty broad beginner zone, but regardless, I guess maybe training age is a better way to frame that. So if you've been training less than 5-6 years, I still want to know what you've noticed, but we may not rely on it quite so much because you're still changing a lot as an athlete. We also might just explore things because sometimes little differences can make a big impact. You may say, pin squats have never really worked for me. Well, where were they in your training week? If it was always, right after deadlifts or something like that, then maybe that's why. Or maybe it caused your lower body volume to drop too much or something along those lines. Well, is that a function of how the loading was? Like was it just too high RPE? Something along those lines. So there's different ways to manipulate some of the details, and I find that usually with people who are very experienced, they've looked a lot of those places already. But still, having a process to go through, like when I was working with Dennis or Brett's kind of become one of my go-to examples for emerging strategies because the process worked really well in his case. We found some things that he didn't necessarily know before, and I mean, he's a partner in that process too, because like he was making observations that I wouldn't have been able to make because they were more experiential. Like he noticed So just to give a little background, in a typical emerging strategies block, each week has the same, it's a very similar training week within each block. The weights are slightly different, but it's the same exercises, the same sets, the same reps. And we're just monitoring the training response. And usually it matches up. So if you respond well to a training intervention for 5 weeks, it's going to be 5 weeks for squat, bench, and deadlift. And normally all the assistance and supplemental exercises will respond similarly. In Brett's case, we noticed that his bench, if we were doing a high intensity block, his bench would kind of peter out around week 3, while everything else was good until week 5. Now, normally when that happens, it's something about the bench training is not tuned correctly. It's maybe too much work, or maybe not enough work, or the exercises aren't all that effective or something, well, because I'm talking to him, he notes that for him, it's like this feeling of accumulated wear and tear, which there's several different ways you could deal with that. But the way we chose to deal with it is that we would just delay the bench block. We would do, something that's slightly lower in intensity for the first 2 weeks of the block, and then go into the high intensity stuff for the last 3 weeks, so that the peak happened all at the same time. So I wouldn't have known that if it wasn't for his observation. So having good communication and good dialogue is really essential.
I really like your philosophical approach to coaching, training, programming, in the sense of you're going to see one side, right? And take Brett, for example, he's going to see it a different way. Like, your perception on it's going to be slightly different. And you want to know that side. And then you also want to know another side. And then you also want to question whether all of them are wrong. You're like, what if everyone is wrong? What about if I'm wrong? What if this doesn't work? And it's like, it for some people it would send them crazy. In the sense of like,
and it
would be wrong.
It can feel like that sometimes, for sure. Even like when you're experienced with it. But I would say that is one benefit to having, it's just to having an experienced coach that can help guide you through that. That way the coach can go crazy about it, and you don't necessarily have to, which is, I guess the secret is that the coaches like that a little bit. They like losing their mind over this stuff a little bit. Otherwise, coaching's not that attractive.
For sure. But, there's a quote by Liam Gallagher, who's actually, it's in one of his songs. He's a musician. It goes, "If I don't go crazy, I'll lose my mind."
Yeah, I can see that. There's an aspect of enjoyment of possibly learning something new. Like, you're really pushing the boundaries there, and it might be just learning something new that applies to this one specific athlete, but that's still useful, and it's still cool, and it's pretty damn important for that athlete too.
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with world champions. Like, that's big.
Yeah, well, in that case, it can impact a lot more than just them. The downstream effects there are pretty pronounced.
And like, one of the main things why myself loves coaching so much is like, you've got to like figure it out. You're like a detective. You know what I mean? And like, every case is different, every athlete's different, every like day to day is different. Let's be honest. Like, someone's going to come in and start adding the psychology of the athlete involved in there. That gets really complicated, especially if things are going on at home, or like a pandemic or whatever starts messing with people's minds. You're like, oh my, like, yesterday everything was perfect. Obviously, perfection is not a thing, but it's close as down it. And now today, you're like, what is going on? Like, it's difficult, but I love it.
That was the thing that, like, there's a specific training version of that thing that would happen from time to time. It would be, we were doing a block. Unfortunately, lots of time. This is like years ago, like pre-2015, I would say. Unfortunately, a lot of times this was like a pre-competition block. You would end up, 3 weeks, 4 weeks out from the competition, and performance would just tank suddenly. And you're like, what the hell is going on? It's too late really to do very much about it, so you're left to kind of in damage control. Unfortunately, that didn't happen every time, but it happened often enough that it was pretty upsetting, But one of the nice things about kind of the emerging strategies framework was that it dealt with that specific case. First of all, it says monitor the athlete and figure out, when do these things happen? Oh, it happens every 5th week or every 6th week. Well, use that and time your blocks appropriately. Well, that makes sense. Also, if that happens, then here's some things that you can do to mitigate it. Okay, well, now I have a roadmap and I have some tools that I can use, some ways to reduce the likelihood that this thing is going to happen. And then if it does happen, some things I can do to fix it or at least make it better. And that's a much better place to be as a coach. The training is more effective. And then as a coach, you feel more confident, and for good reason too. You're more potent as a coach too.
For sure. If you were gonna give one piece of advice, right, to a young lifter and an old lifter, so someone who's kind of just got into this SBD stuff and someone who's been in it for fucking years, what would you give them, and how would they like conflict each other if they would?
That's a tough one. So for the young lifter, I would say to make sure that they're logging things and logging their training in a way that helps them make decisions. It might be, writing it in a notebook for a little while. But you need to have a way to digest that and turn it into something. Find a way to make good decisions. What is it that you're responding well to? Well, if you're a novice lifter, you're responding well to everything, but you're still responding better to some things than other things, even if it's all fairly positive. And someday you won't respond well to everything. And like, collecting training data is the retirement savings of powerlifting. It's if you wait until you need it, then you've waited too late. And for an older lifter, that one's a little bit more difficult because there tends to be a lot of variance. Like on one end, you could say, the same type of thing applies. Now, an older lifter can also lean on their experience a bit more, that they have learned a lot of these lessons just implicitly through the years. But that's not necessarily the case. You definitely see some older lifters who are just doing the thing that they've always done, without a whole lot of thought. And I mean, it's never too late, right? Like, we've worked with Masters 3, Masters 4 lifters, and it's used essentially the same process. It's like, okay, well, let's start logging your training. We have more to go from, because we can say, what do you know about your own training? Well, I like to train this way. These things work, those things don't work. There's more to go off of. So hopefully we can make an educated guess, but still we need to log the training, see what's actually happening, and kind of find this balance point of like exploring new things, but then also leaning on the things that we know work to build our future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Like,
I don't know if that qualifies as advice necessarily, but
no, 100%. Like, documenting what you've been doing to be able to go back and decipher the code,
yeah,
really, right? It's like an enigma code. You've got to go back and figure it out. I think
sure.
is really important. And I don't know where my old training logs are, but they're somewhere.
I've thought about that. Like I've thought about, I wonder if I could, hire somebody on Fiverr to take my old training logs and like just do the data entry
Mhm.
into the training log app. Like I wonder what I might notice from that.
Mm,
I mean, on one hand, it would be fun to look at, but I don't know how meaningful it would be because there is an expiration date on these types of things. You would think that the training that you're doing is having some kind of effect, um, that you're not the same person, the same athlete that you were, you know, a year or 2 years ago. Um, and even if your training is fairly ineffective, you're at least a couple years older,
mhm.
So I think that it's probably not vastly useful to look at training logs from when I was like 19 or something, but it would be interesting, and
Mm.
that might be worth it by itself.
More for the nostalgia, right?
Yeah, or maybe idea generation, because
Mm.
even like I do remember quite a bit about how I trained then. And even if I looked at it and was like, holy shit, that was really effective, I wouldn't just copy that system. I would want to translate it into what does that mean to me today, you know? And so it's going to look different. Like back in the day, I trained with more of a West Side uh, kind of style. And I just don't see me adopting max effort days and stuff like that the same way. Now, I may take some inspiration and, design some new strategies that are kind of inspired by the old. And that is potentially useful.
Why wouldn't you go more West Side route today?
It's not so much about the West Side component of it. It's just that, you learn things along the way, and you don't necessarily want to discard all the stuff that you've learned along the way just to reinstall an old operating system.
Mm.
So it would be find a way to integrate the parts that worked from before with what I've learned in the time since.
Create some sort of hybrid.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm. That'd be really interesting.
I mean, I think that's kind of how it always goes. You start where you start, but you learn new things, and then you've got to integrate that with all the stuff that you've learned, up to this point.
Yes, sir. That's how we all develop, right? And create new systems and improve and push the boat out just a little bit further each time.
Right, right.
Mm.
That's the ideal, at least, right?
Yeah, rather than 4 sets of 10.
Exactly.
But hey, like if you're gonna get in the gym and it's the only thing you're gonna be doing and you're gonna be doing 4 sets of 10, then get in the gym and do 4 sets of 10, right? We can sit here and be like, that's probably not the most optimal training program to do, but if it's the only one you're gonna do and it's the one that you're gonna stick to, just
Yeah,
go in and do something. We'd rather you move and be somewhat healthier than completely geek out like the likes of ourselves and try and like find the perfect program, even though we know that doesn't exist, because
sure.
eventually we'll be able to improve upon it. But get in and do something, even if it's Zumba, right?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely been guilty of not super often, but I've definitely skipped a workout or two because I was working on an idea, which is kind of ironic at the point where it actually happens. It's like this is the thing that we tell people not to do, but I don't know. Then in the grand scheme, like what's more, what has a bigger impact on the long term? Is it the one workout that I do, or is it having all future workouts being some increment better? I mean,
Mm.
I'm not advocating that most people would do that, and if you're doing that more than like a couple times a year, then it's probably not worth the trade. you know um, but yeah, that is a thing that I've done, and I've thought this is exactly the thing that I tell people not to
Yeah,
do.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, like we said, like if you don't go crazy, you'll lose your mind.
Right, yeah.
And if you yeah, if you have that idea and you don't work upon it, like it's not a good trade-off
That's
then.
the good shit though. Like that's the stuff that keeps me coming back, is like
Mm.
uh you know pushing those ideas. So uh if I'm kind of in that sort of state, then that's the most enjoyable thing I could be doing with that time anyway. So
Mm.
you may as well.
Locked away in the office with a whiteboard or a pen and paper, just going at it.
Yeah, like I said, losing my mind over fatigue or whatever it was. I gave a presentation about this, for a while, I guess, before the world ended. Um, I was I would give a presentation about like my ramblings on fatigue, which weren't at the time very conclusive, but it was at least interesting. And in the intervening time, I would say I've made some more progress on turning it into actionable stuff.
Wow. Like the whole losing your mind. Literally, I
Mm,
read a part of it this morning in whatever book I'm reading at the moment, right? And it was like
mm,
all the famous whatever playwrights would just lock themselves away and would tell the gardeners to go round their viewing spot of whatever little building they're sat in, so they can literally just sit there and just look out to the ocean or look out to the woods or whatever they're looking at, and just be completely immersed in this like mental realm. And I'm like, oh, I absolutely relate to that so hard.
yeah,
It's quite funny.
yeah. I mean, I think that's creativity in a lot of ways,
Mm,
and it's funny because I never thought of myself as like a creative type, that I just didn't fit the mental image that I had for creative types, I guess,
mm,
until I guess some couple years ago. But it finally occurred to me, like, yeah, okay, that I can relate, like in the ways that you're talking about. And I remember we were at a competition with the whole group, and I said something about not being a creative type, and everyone on the team laughed at me. And kind of, I thought maybe I should reevaluate how I
mm,
see myself.
mm.
So,
I mean, you created all this, right?
yeah,
From
yeah,
concepts
and
just coming up in your mind.
yeah,
And if
yeah,
that's not creative, I have no idea what is.
yeah. I suppose in my mind it was a little bit more. Um, what's the word for it? I can't remember the word for it, but I guess archetypal, maybe. Like there's kind of this archetype that I've got in my mind of like what like a
Mm,
creative person is,
yeah.
a stereotypical playwright or, artists and shit like that. And I don't really fit that mold, but
Mhm,
it's just, I was incorrect in my stereotyping, I guess.
mhm. Yeah, an artist with a barbell, right?
Yeah.
Um, I I heard these two questions, right? Maybe
Mm.
2 weeks ago, and I've been racking my brains ever since, and literally just been asking everyone, whether it's having conversations like we're doing now, or I'll drag someone off the street and be like, guys, give me the answer to this, like, because it's a wicked question. The first one is like, What's the best life advice you've ever received?
Hmm. I don't know, man. So that's hard to pin down. It's hard to
Mm,
pin down like one thing. Um, can I give you two pieces?
yeah, for sure.
Make
As
it
many as
make
you
it a
want.
little easier on myself. So, I mean, I don't think any of this will be terribly shocking to you, but um, one is just kind of an idea around responsibility. You know, like I own a business, and technically everything that happens in that business is my responsibility.
Hmm.
You know, that somebody has a bad customer service experience, like, well, I'm not doing customer service, but it's still my responsibility. And if we implement some plan for a product or a strategy or something, and it doesn't work, then ultimately it all has to come back to me. um, and I think that's a useful way to think about most things, even if it's not exactly true. I think it's one of these things that's probably not exactly true, but it's often useful,
Hmm.
um, and kind of leaning toward that uh, responsibility viewpoint. And then the other thing that's come up a lot for me lately, lately being the last several months at least, there was a quote that we had to learn when I was at the Air Force Academy. Uh, it's that a good plan executed now is better than a perfect plan next week.
Mm.
And I mean, it alludes to, perfect being the enemy of the good, which is what a lot of people are familiar with as well. But that seems to have been coming up quite a bit lately. Well, I know that there's more that we would like to do, but we need to do something rather than just wait for it to be perfect.
It's the man in the arena quote, right?
Yeah, yeah, that one as well.
Yeah, that's my all-time favorite. That the first time I ever heard that absolutely kicked me in the throat, and I was like, "Wow,
Yeah,
that just encapsulates everything so perfectly."
yeah.
Probably will go down as one of the greatest speeches of all time, and
Oh,
I'd throw my chips into that hat.
yeah.
And the second part is, what's the worst advice you've ever received?
uh, it's funny because like the best advice tends to be general, right?
Mm,
And the worst advice tends to be specific.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
like I can think of some specific things where I look back and think like, man, that was a bad idea.
Mm,
It's hard to generalize it. Um, like the first thing that popped to my mind. Um, so performing submax singles in training is a thing that's become pretty ubiquitous in powerlifting. Singles at 8 RPE is a meme. Um, it wasn't always that way, and I have a lot to do with popularizing that trend, and I think generally it's good, right? But I remember kind of first starting down this road. Also, a bit more context. Powerlifting training used to skew a lot harder than is currently commonplace.
mhm.
Like the idea of 8 or 9 RPE would have been considered like moderate, or low. And now, you know, I have people who tell me like, no, 8 or 9 RPE is high. 6, 7 is moderate, and below 6 is low. And I think like, look, if you went back to like 2009 and told somebody that they needed to train, mostly like sub 6 RPE, no one would believe it. No one would do it. Everyone was training harder than that. And I mean, the utility there is a totally different discussion, but I just say that to bring in a bit more context. So when I was first starting to dabble with frequent singles in training was around the last time that Bulgarian style training got really popular in powerlifting, which would have been, 2012 to 2014 timeframe, I think. Might have my dates a little bit wrong there, but at any rate, I knew that I didn't want to do like full on daily maxing. But I thought, like, how can I take some value from this idea and implement it? And so I was doing a single at 9 RPE each week. And I remember on deadlift, this came out to be like 800 pounds or something. And I was obviously a good deadlifter. And I was really wanting to get to 860. That's what John Cook pulled in the same weight class the year I was born, 1985. And that was a record that stood for decades. And so that was the milestone that I wanted to get to. And I remember thinking to myself, if I pull 800 pounds every week for 10 weeks, then there's just no way that I could not pull something close to 860 at the end of that. And that's just wrong. There's plenty of ways that could not work, and I mean, I guess most of the bad advice that I've got, or cautionary tales that I've got, come in the form of hubris in some way. There's no way this can fail. There's no way this will be great. Like, no way this could go wrong. There definitely is. And if you don't know what it is, then that's a huge blind spot for you,
Yeah, totally. I'm sure I've heard many times something that hits that ballpoint quite accurately, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of others too, right? I'm not sure how many personal life stories we need to go into, like cautionary tales from Mike's personal life. But I mean, in terms of bad advice, I'm not sure that qualifies as advice either, but in terms of bad advice being specific and difficult to generalize, I guess it's generalizable. We just have to look a little bit closer. But for me, it all kind of comes back to that. Hubris of just like, nah, it'll be fine. We don't need to be cautious. We don't need to hedge. We don't need to,
Blind
consider
optimism, right?
alternatives. Yeah, it's just, that's a bad plan. Hallmarks of a bad plan, right?
So yeah, exactly. Like sometimes you miss that naivety, and then other times you're like, well, a lot of things have got wrong, so I kind of don't.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Mike, thank you so much for your time.
It's been an enjoyable conversation, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you, man. I'll let you get back to your wonderful kids.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Take it easy. Thank you very much.
You too.